I'm Michael Carr with Veritas Literary Agency, and this is How to Hook an Agent. Today we're going to talk about 5 mistakes to avoid when querying a literary agent. First of all, don't brag. This seems pretty obvious to say, but you'd be surprised how many people get on and start bragging about how big their book is going to be, how it's brilliant. I literally had someone say this book was going to be a bestseller that was going to earn 7 figures, maybe even 8 figures, and said afterwards, "Get on the train, Michael. This train is leaving the station and you don't want to miss out." If you do that sort of a thing, you're going to come across as someone who's difficult to work with, who starts off with unreasonable expectations as to how well their career is going to be doing, and this is not an impression you want to give for someone who is hoping to have a realistic understanding of what possibilities your career might be. Nobody likes to be with someone who brags and who tries to make themselves sound like the greatest thing ever. Even when you're talking about people who are highly experienced professionals, if you're meeting someone like Stephen King or J.K. Rowling, you still don't want to hear them brag about how great they are. So if you're a writer and you come across this way, then it's just going to turn off the literary agent. And there's a really good chance you're just going to either get a form rejection if you're lucky, or more likely they're just going to delete your email. Secondly, and very similar to this, don't make inappropriate comparisons in your query. So if you've written a fantasy, say a YA fantasy, don't say this is just like Hunger Games, right? If you've written something that is a contemporary thriller, you don't want to compare it to Dan Brown. That is going to tell the agent, first of all, that your knowledge of the genre is probably pretty shallow, and mainly you are aware of the mega bestsellers and not much else. That's the good interpretation. The bad interpretation is, once again, that you have unrealistic expectations about what the market might be. The reasons why this is going to come back and bite you are also obvious. Comparisons, comp titles are not a bad thing. They're a good thing, and comparing to other titles that have done well. And if your query shows that this is a good close comparison, those can really show the agent that you've done your homework, that you have an understanding of the category that you're working in, etc. But if the comparison is either too big, or another problem might be too broad, then I'm gonna look at that and say this is really not like that. It just comes across as someone who's not particularly educated in what they're doing. Another problem with an inappropriate comparison might be picking a book that's way too old. It's surprising how many people will go all the way back to something like Jane Austen and say this is like Pride and Prejudice or something, apart from the fact that this has nothing to do with the modern market. Again, it's just an over-the-top comparison. More common would be someone who is comparing to old noir books of the 40s and 50s, Dashiell Hammett maybe. People will mention science fiction and fantasy from the 60s and 70s, comparing themselves to people who have been dead for 30 years, or at the very least, people who may still be working in the genre, but broke in during a different era. I would say if your comp title is more than 10 or 15 years old, in fact, maybe even more than 5 years old, that there's a good chance that this is an inappropriate comparison and doesn't have a lot to do with what the market is looking for at this moment. Remember, even if you pick a comp title that came out yesterday, this is probably a book that the author began working on maybe 3 years ago. It was maybe accepted a year and a half ago and came out, maybe a year ago. even that is not necessarily really up to date. But that's really what you should be looking for with your comp titles. Number 3, going back to the don't bragging, don't apologize. That's the flip side of that. For every person who just seems to have an ego so big it will expand to fill any known space, there's someone out there who feels like they don't have the right to be working in this place for whatever reason. Don't come and say, I'm an amateur, I'm not very good yet. Hopefully, you'll take my hand and lead me along and show me. You need to come across as someone who's professional, who has enough confidence in their ability to enter this professional space and be taken seriously. Don't in any way feel like you have to feel bad for not having had experience. And if we're talking strictly novels too, if you worry that your credits aren't big enough, then just remember the number one credit that I'm looking for as a literary agent with a new novelist is I want someone who's written a kick-ass novel. That's the only thing that really matters. And so your other credits, well, they might be nice if you can find some, aren't essential to the primary task at hand for me, which is identifying someone who really knows how to write, and identify that person who really knows how to write by looking at their writing. So don't apologize. You don't have to feel bad for what you have or haven't accomplished. Along those lines, don't tell me that you're really young, right? Don't tell me that you're really old. Don't tell me that you had a third grade education, whatever. None of that is irrelevant. For one thing, there is some ageism in this business. People want to feel like they're signing someone who has a longer career. I'm someone who has signed both younger and older agents, but I know that some people have the feeling that someone who's young hasn't put in the time and someone who's old has not enough time left. You don't need to mention that sort of thing. Or again, third grade education. It's really, unless it's relevant to your story, don't put that in there, because if you come across as someone who is uneducated, that's going to harm you. And if you don't, it doesn't really matter. Number 4, don't include irrelevant information. And what do I mean by irrelevant information? You've got a limited amount of space in your query letter, and it's surprising how many people put in all sorts of stuff that doesn't matter. A little bit of biographical information is good and useful. It's probably not necessary unless it's really impressive. If you just got off a tour on the International Space Station, for example, then that's something that's going to be a really impressive credit. If you're head of surgery at some hospital, yeah. But if you're a school teacher, heck, even if you're just a doctor, a surgeon, nobody really cares about that unless you're writing medical things. It's irrelevant unless it has to do with your work or your credits. People feel like they have to put in biographical information. You really don't. It's just using up space, valuable real estate in your query letter. And I would say that there are times when it comes across as really amateurish. For example, I am the mother to 3 fur babies, 2 cats, and an adorable golden retriever. Well, then that's not something you should put in there. People who talk about their family relationships. I live with my wife, my hamster, and my 2 children. No, you don't want anything like that. It uses up valuable real estate, and it's completely irrelevant to your query. Finally, don't try to reinvent the wheel. There's a reason that a query has the format that it has, and that is because it's like a book cover in a bookstore. It gives an indication as to what we're looking at, what we're looking for. If I'm walking into a bookstore and all the covers are shiny, weird things that don't have titles and things, and I'm looking for, say, a guidebook, because I'm going to go to Spain and Portugal, then I want my books organized in the right place. I want them to have covers that look appropriate. everything down to the font that looks, if it looks professional. And your query has a certain sort of packaging that needs to follow that same sort of thing. I want to get in there and I want to look and say, here's what it is, its title, its genre, maybe how long it is, maybe what comparable titles there are, and then get right down to the writing. And I can then look at that and determine if that's appropriate for me and what I might want to represent. If you're going and trying to reinvent something to stand out, you're going to stand out, but in the wrong sort of a way. And once again, you're going to look amateurish, and that is probably just going to get you rejected. So what is standard query formatting? Well, I'm not going to get into that here. I'll cover that in some other videos, but it's really easy to find, right? There's a lot of information out there online. People who are willing to share their queries that they're working on or share queries that have worked. A lot of generous people, including some literary agents, have gone and put that out there. Learn that. Learn it like you would learn the opening to a chess game, for example, because you're going to need to do the same thing every time, which is not to say there's not a place for your creativity to come out. There is, but don't try to do it via reinventing what a query looks like. It's just not going to work. I can tell you, if you've seen a case where someone said, I did something completely different and look how well it worked. It used to be back when we'd receive paper queries, people would send little things in the envelope, stickers or chocolates as little bribes. Fortunately, with electronic submissions, that doesn't happen anymore, but people will try to do virtually the same thing by embedding graphics, by changing fonts and colors and bolding and highlighting. And in addition to it's clear this person just doesn't understand. It's like putting together a resume. Not every resume looks exactly the same, but all resumes fit within a certain set of parameters. And you need to think of a query in the same way, put it together. So here's 5 tips for you. They're not the only tips out there. There's a whole bunch of other stuff you can do right or wrong, but those are 5 things, 5 mistakes to avoid when putting together your query letter.